The crystal flute didn't just slip. It shattered inside Pearlie's grip, shards biting into her palm as the microphone feedback screeched through the golden night ballroom. Blood, hot and red, mixed with the chilled vintage Dom Perignon dripping onto the marble floor. From the shadows of the crowd, she watched her world end in high definition. On stage, Choi Han-ul stood under the spotlight, impeccable in his white tuxedo, the picture of a devoted fiancé, just not hers. He didn't look for her. He didn't scan the crowd for the woman who had built his family's architectural legacy. His eyes were fixed on the front row, on the older man with the checkbook. "To secure the Choi Group's future," Han-ul said, his voice smooth, devoid of the warmth he used to whisper to her, "I am proud to announce a strategic union with the Han Tech family, and my engagement to their daughter Minjai." One sentence. That's all it took to erase 3 years. He didn't hesitate. He sold Pearlie for a merger. The room erupted in polite applause. Pearlie stumbled backward, the sound of clapping roaring like a wave. She had to leave. Now, before the shock wore off and the screaming started. She turned, her black evening dress swirling around her, and fled the ballroom, leaving a trail of blood drops on the pristine floor. She burst out of the hotel service exit and into the pouring Seoul rain. The flash of paparazzi cameras blinded her. She was cornered. Ms. Pearlie, Ms. Pearlie." She backed away, trembling, only to collide with a wall of muscle. A hand, large and scarred, gripped her arm, not to hurt, but to steady. The paparazzi cameras instantly lowered, the photographers retreating in sudden, terrified silence. Pearlie looked up, rain matting her long braids against her neck. She wasn't looking at a savior. She was looking at a nightmare. A man in a sharp black suit, water sluicing over slicked-back hair and dragging over the terrifying black dragon tattoos crawling up his neck. Gong Jaiho, the exiled uncle, the monster. His expression was cold, dominant, and utterly unbothered by the chaos. He glanced at the blood on her hand, then at the terror in her eyes. "Get in," he commanded, his voice deeper than the thunder, gesturing to the open door of a pitch-black limousine. "Unless you prefer the wolves." Before we dive into this thrilling story, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. Where are you watching from? Like, comment, and share. The heavy service door slammed shut, severing the sound of applause, but the silence didn't last. The Seoul night was drowning in a torrential downpour, the kind that froze skin on contact. Pearlie kicked off her heels, leaving the expensive satin ruined in a puddle of oily water. She didn't care. She just needed to breathe, but the air was thick with exhaust and misery. She ran, the asphalt biting into her bare soles, her black gown heavy and clinging like a second skin. But she didn't get far. A wall of blinding white flashes erupted at the mouth of the alley. The paparazzi, vultures sensing fresh blood, swarmed. "Ms. Pearlie, over here. Is it true about the merger? Did you know he was trading you?" They blocked her path, shoving microphones into her face, capturing every second of her humiliation in high definition. Pearlie backed away, her hands trembling as she tried to shield her eyes. She was trapped between the locked door of her past and the blinding cruelty of her present. Suddenly, tires screeched, a violent, tearing sound that cut through the cacophony. A massive black SUV drifted around the corner, mounting the curb with aggressive precision. The heavy bumper stopped inches from the swarm, forcing the photographers to dive aside or risk being crushed. The rear door opened. The man who stepped out didn't need an umbrella. The rain seemed to hesitate around him. He was tall, imposing, radiating a darkness that swallowed the streetlights. His suit was sharp, black, and immaculately tailored, but it was the ink creeping up his neck that froze the air in Pearlie's lungs. A dragon, scaled and jagged, coiled up to his jawline, marking him as something far worse than a corporate shark. Gong Jaiho. The reporters recognized him instantly. The shouted questions died in their throats. Cameras were lowered, not out of respect, but out of primal fear. Jaiho didn't even look at them. His cold, dominant gaze was locked entirely on Pearlie. He looked at her bare feet, the blood on her hand, the rain plastering the braids to her shivering frame. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer a tissue. He offered an ultimatum. Get in, he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the wet pavement. He held the door open, his expression unreadable, terrifyingly void of pity. Or stay in the rain. Pearlie looked at the dark interior of the car, then back at the hungry lens of a camera that had dared to lift again. The choice was between a pack of wolves and a dragon. She stepped toward the dragon. The silence inside the limousine was heavier than the storm outside. The heavy thud of the door ceiling shut cut off the screaming reporters instantly, replacing the chaos with the hum of a powerful engine and the scent of expensive leather and cedarwood. Pearlie pressed herself against the door, water dripping from her braids onto the pristine upholstery. Her hand still throbbed, the blood staining her palm a stark contrast to the dark interior. She watched the man across from her. In the dim amber mood lighting, Gong Jai-ho looked less like a savior and more like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Here. He extended a white silk handkerchief. His voice was calm, a terrifying counterpoint to the adrenaline crashing through her veins. Pearlie took it hesitantly, wrapping it around her bleeding palm. They said you were dead, she whispered, her voice raspy. The Choi family, Hanul, they said you died in a warehouse fire in Busan 10 years ago. Dead is a convenient term for erased, Jai-ho replied, leaning back. The movement caused his suit jacket to shift, exposing more of the ink that darkened his throat. My brother Hanul's father preferred me gone. It made stealing my share of the empire easier. He turned his gaze to the window, watching the blurred city lights streak by. But exile has an expiration date. I'm back to take what is mine, the company, the territory, the legacy. He paused, his eyes sliding back to her, sharp and assessing. But the family trust has archaic stipulations. To reclaim my seat at the table without bloodshed, I need a stabilizing influence. I need a wife. Pearlie went cold. The realization hit her harder than the rain. You didn't save me. I saw an opportunity, he corrected, unashamed. Mutual benefit. You want to disappear, I can make that happen. You want to burn them down, I can make that happen too. He leaned forward, invading her personal space. The air between them crackled with a sudden, suffocating tension. His dark eyes traced the elegant line of her jaw, lingering on the intricate weaving of her long braids and the way the black dress clung to her form. It wasn't a look of lust, but of appraisal, like a collector realizing the value of a rare artifact found in the trash. Hanul is blind, Jai-ho murmured, his voice dropping to a rough timbre that vibrated in Pearlie's chest. He looks at spreadsheets and sees power. He looks at you and sees a liability. Jai-ho sat back, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. Such elegance, such fire. He shook his head slowly. You were wasted on a boy like Hanul. The limousine glided into the subterranean entrance of the Obsidia, a structure that loomed over Gangnam like a dark monolith. It was ostensibly a high-end club, but as Jai-ho guided Pearlie through the service corridors, passing men who bowed with terrified reverence, it felt more like a fortress. They ascended to the top floor in a silent, private elevator. Jai-ho's office was a cavern of dark mahogany and floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the city that had just chewed Pearlie up and spit her out. The rain lashed against the windows, but inside, the air was still and temperature-controlled. Jai-ho walked behind his massive desk and didn't sit. He simply slid a thick, heavy document across the polished wood. Read it, he commanded softly. Pearlie stepped forward, her bare feet sinking into the plush Persian rug. She picked up the document. It was a marriage contract, but the clauses were terrifyingly specific. It demanded absolute silence, total loyalty, and a binding of assets that would make them inseparable in the eyes of the law and the underworld. It wasn't just a union, it was an abdication of her freedom. Her eyes drifted from the paper to the object resting casually next to an expensive crystal decanter. A gun. A matte black semi-automatic, resting on the desk as casually as a paperweight. It was a stark, violent reminder of who she was dealing with. This wasn't a corporate merger. This was a blood oath. There is no divorce in my line of work, Pearlie, Jai-ho said, his voice low, vibrating with a dangerous gravity. He watched her reaction to the weapon, testing her flinch. You sign this and you cross a line. Hanul broke your heart with a microphone. If you betray me, the consequences will be far more physical. Pearlie looked at the gun, then at the contract. She thought of Hanul's face under the stage lights, the smug, calculated way he had discarded her for a tech investor's daughter. She thought of the pity in the eyes of the crowd. The humiliation burned hotter than the fear of the weapon on the desk. She was done being the elegant, passive victim. If she was going to burn, she would burn standing next to the devil. I don't need an exit clause, she whispered, her voice steadying. She picked up the heavy fountain pen. The ink was as black as the night outside. With a trembling hand that grew firmer with every stroke, she signed her name. She chose the danger of the gun over the heartbreak of the ballroom. Jai-ho watched the ink dry, a dark, terrifying satisfaction settling in his eyes. Good, he murmured. Now you are mine. There was no white. White was for innocence, for new beginnings, for women who hadn't been publicly discarded like trash. That part of Pearlie had died on the ballroom floor. Instead, she wore crimson, a deep, blood-red silk that pooled around her feet like a warning. The ceremony took place in the inner sanctum of the club, a windowless room soundproofed against the world. The only light came from heavy pillars of beeswax candles, casting long, dancing shadows against the dark mahogany walls. There were no flowers, no string quartet, and no smiling relatives. There were only witnesses, 6 of Jai-ho's top lieutenants standing in the periphery, silent and lethal. They stood like statues in dark suits, their hands clasped respectfully in front of them, eyes averted. They weren't there to celebrate a union. They were there to witness a transfer of power. Pearlie walked toward him, the silk whispering against the floor. Jai-ho waited at the end of the room. He had shed the sharp suit jacket, standing in a black dress shirt with the top buttons undone. In the flickering candlelight, Pearlie saw the full extent of the art branded onto his skin for the first time. The dragons didn't just peek out from a collar, they dominated his throat. Dark, intricate scales coiled upward from his collarbone, the ink so detailed it seemed to writhe with his pulse. The jaws of the beast rested just below his ear, permanently open, permanently ready to strike. The efficient, a nervous man who clearly knew better than to make eye contact with the groom, rushed through the vows in hushed Korean. Pearlie barely heard the words. Her focus was consumed by the heat radiating from Jai-ho as he took her hand. His grip was firm, calloused, a hand that dealt violence wrapped around fingers that drew blueprints. "Do you take this man?" the officiant stammered. "I do," Pearlie said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You may kiss the bride." The words hung in the heavy air. Jai-ho didn't hesitate. He didn't lean in tentatively like Hanul used to, waiting for a social cue or a camera flash. He stepped into her space, dominating the air around her. His hand slid up her neck, his thumb resting heavily over her racing pulse, forcing her head back. When his mouth captured hers, it wasn't a performance. It was heavy, possessive, and bruising. It tasted of scotch and danger. It was a seal on the contract she had signed, a physical branding that told every man in the room, and Pearlie herself, that she was no longer just an architect or an ex-fiancée. She was the property of the dragon, and God help her, as his grip tightened on her waist, she didn't pull away. The penthouse wasn't a home, it was a fortress suspended in the sky. The elevator opened directly into a sprawling expanse of black marble and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a God's eye view of Seoul, yet the silence was absolute. The walls were thick, reinforced, designed to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep the secrets in. Pearlie wandered into the master suite, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. The space was terrifyingly masculine, stripped of any softness until she opened the walk-in closet. One side had been cleared, filled with rows of silk robes and evening wear in shades of onyx, silver, and blood red. He had prepared for her arrival with chilling efficiency. She pulled open the bedside drawer, looking for a charger, but her hand froze. Resting on a velvet lining was a compact pistol, fully loaded. Beside it, a note in elegant, sharp handwriting, "Safety off. Point and squeeze." A shiver traced down her spine. This was the reality of her marriage. Silk against her skin, steel within her reach. A muffled thud from the living area. shattered the quiet. Pearlie pulled her robe tighter, drawn by a morbid curiosity she couldn't suppress. She crept down the hallway, stopping in the shadows of the corridor. In the sunken living room below, the furniture had been pushed back. A man was on his knees, his face a ruin of blood and bruises, whimpering through a gag. Jai-ho stood over him, his dress shirt rolled up to the elbows. He didn't look angry, he looked bored. With a sudden, terrifying burst of violence, Jai-ho lashed out, the heel of his boot connecting with the man's ribs. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. The man collapsed, wheezing, but Jai-ho merely adjusted his watch, signaling to 2 guards to drag the body away. "Get him out," Jai-ho said, his voice flat, "and burn the rug." He turned, and his eyes locked onto the shadows of the hallway. He had known she was there the whole time. Pearlie stopped breathing, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just watched a monster at work. But as Jai-ho walked toward her, the darkness in his eyes seemed to recede, replaced by an unsettling calm. He didn't wipe his hands, he didn't hide the violence. He stopped on the step below her, bringing him to eye level. He reached out, his knuckles raw and red, and tucked a loose braid behind her ear. His touch was feather-light, a shocking, gentle contrast to the brutality she had just witnessed. "The soundproofing isn't finished in the East Wing," he said softly, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Go back to bed, Pearlie. The nightmares are down here, not up there." The vibration of the phone on the marble kitchen island sounded like a drill in the quiet penthouse morning. Pearlie was sipping coffee, wrapped in one of the silk robes Jai-ho had provided, when the screen lit up. Choi Han-ul. The name hit her like a physical blow. For 3 years, seeing that name had meant comfort, plans, a future. Now it just looked like a scar. Her hand trembled as she unlocked the screen. Min-jae pulled the funding. "The deal is dead. I made a mistake, Pearlie. I was pressured. I did it for the family, but I can't do this without you. Please just answer, come home." Pearlie stared at the words, her breath hitching. He was ruined. The merger had failed. A treacherous, familiar ache bloomed in her chest. "He needs me." It was the old reflex, the muscle memory of being the supportive partner who fixed his messes, who smoothed over his anxieties. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She wasn't going to say yes, but the urge to ask why, to demand an explanation, to engage, was overwhelming. She didn't hear Jai-ho approach. She only felt the sudden warmth of his chest against her back and saw a scarred hand reach over her shoulder. He didn't snatch the phone. He plucked it from her grip with gentle, terrifying authority. "He lost the money," Jai-ho read the text aloud, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "So now he remembers the woman." "He says it was a mistake," Pearlie whispered, adding the wobble in her voice. "It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculation," Jai-ho corrected, tossing the phone onto the counter. He turned her around, forcing her to look at him. His dark eyes were intense, searching hers for any sign of the old Pearlie, the one who would have run back to be a consolation prize. "He gambled you for a paycheck, Pearlie, and he lost. Now he wants his insurance policy back." Pearlie looked down, shame heating her face. "I wasn't going to go back." "But you were going to reply," Jai-ho said. "You were going to give him a window." He picked up the phone again and placed it in her hand, covering her fingers with his own. He guided her thumb to the contact settings. "Men like Han-ul feed on attention. Even your anger feeds him. It tells him he still matters." Jai-ho's grip tightened slightly, grounding her. "You don't negotiate with a ghost. You exorcise him." He pressed her thumb down. "Block contact." The name vanished from the screen, replaced by a generic list of numbers. The finality of it was sudden, jarring, and then freeing. "He doesn't exist anymore," Jai-ho murmured, kissing her forehead. "Not in this world, and certainly not in yours." The boutique in Cheongdam-dong was usually a hive of whispers and judgment, but today it was a mausoleum of silence. Jai-ho had bought the entire afternoon, and with it, the absolute discretion of the terrified staff who stood, lined up against the wall, eyes averted. He didn't browse, he hunted. Pearlie stood by the velvet curtains of the dressing room, watching him dismiss rack after rack of modest, elegant gowns, the kind she would have chosen for herself. The kind Hanul would have approved of because they didn't draw attention. "No," Jai-ho said, his voice cutting through the soft jazz playing overhead. He pointed to a mannequin in the center of the display. "That one." It was a weapon made of fabric, a floor-length gown of liquid obsidian sequins that hugged every curve with unforgiving precision. The back was entirely open, plunging dangerously low, and the slit up the thigh was a challenge to anyone who dared to look. "It's too much," Pearlie whispered as the trembling assistant brought it to her. "It's enough," Jai-ho corrected. When Pearlie stepped out of the dressing room, the air in the shop seemed to thin. The dress didn't just fit, it devoured her. It took the soft, heartbroken woman who had fled the ballroom and encased her in armor that shimmered like oil on water. She looked at herself in the trifold mirror and didn't recognize the reflection. She looked dangerous. Jai-ho stood behind her, his dark eyes meeting hers in the glass. He didn't smile. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a long, flat velvet box. He opened it, revealing a cascade of diamonds that looked like captured starlight, cold, heavy, and blindingly expensive. Pearlie's breath hitched. She knew the market value of stones like that. "Jai-ho," she breathed. This costs more than Hanul's entire company." "Then let him choke on the realization," he murmured. He lifted the necklace, the cold metal brushing against the warm skin of her throat. He fastened the clasp with deliberate slowness, his fingers lingering on the nape of her neck, right over her pulse. The weight of the diamonds settled on her collarbone, a physical anchor grounding her in his reality. He leaned in close, his lips brushing her ear, his reflection towering over hers in the mirror, the dark suit and the dragon tattoos framing her elegance in shadow. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Pearlie lifted her chin. "Hanul wanted a pawn," Jai-ho whispered, his voice vibrating through her spine. "But tonight you are not a victim, Pearlie. You are the boss's wife. Act like it." The heavy oak doors to the grand ballroom didn't just open. They were pushed wide by unseen hands, interrupting the string quartet mid-measure. The silence that followed was instant and absolute, a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. Pearlie stepped across the threshold. The obsidian dress caught the light of the chandeliers, turning her into a living, breathing blade. Beside her, Gong Jai-ho was a shadow made flesh, his hand heavy and possessive on the curve of her waist. They didn't walk like guests. They walked like owners inspecting a property they intended to condemn. The elite of Seoul parted like the Red Sea. Their gazes bounced frantically between the resurrected exile and the woman they had watched flee in tears only weeks ago. Now there were no tears, only diamonds, cold, hard, and worth more than their collective portfolios, resting against her dark skin. Pearlie kept her chin high, her eyes scanning the crowd with a coolness she had learned from the man beside her. Choi Hanul stood at the center of the room, a champagne glass halfway to his mouth. He froze, his face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked at Pearlie, not the broken girl, but this glittering, untouchable queen, and then his eyes locked on the dragon tattoo peeking above Jai-ho's collar. The ghost had returned. Panic replaced shock. Hanul dropped his glass. It shattered against the floor, a poetic echo of Pearlie's own heartbreak weeks prior. "Security," Hanul screeched, his voice cracking and desperate. He pointed a trembling finger at the couple. "Remove them. He is trespassing. Kang, get them out." Mr. Kang, the head of security who had served the Choi family for 20 years, stepped out from the shadows of the pillars. He moved with purpose, flanked by 4 large guards. Hanul let out a breath of relief, straightening his jacket, waiting for the violence to begin. "Throw him out, Kang," Hanul commanded, "and her too." Mr. Kang stopped 3 feet from Jai-ho. He didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't reach for Pearlie. Slowly, deliberately, the head of security bowed, a deep, 90-degree bend of total, terrified submission. The 4 guards behind him followed suit, snapping their heels together and bowing in unison. "Welcome back, boss," Kang murmured to the floor. Jai-ho didn't even blink. He simply tightened his grip on Pearlie's waist and guided her through the corridor of bowed heads. "It seems," Jai-ho said, his voice carrying clearly over the stunned silence, "that the staff remembers who actually built this house." The silence in the ballroom was shattered by Hanul's desperate scramble. Stripped of his security and his dignity, he lunged toward them, stopping only when Jaiho shifted his weight, a subtle, lethal movement that promised violence without a single blow being thrown. "Pearly, please," Hanul gasped, sweat beading on his forehead, ruining the facade of the golden boy. He ignored his uncle, focusing his manic gaze entirely on her. "You don't understand. I was forced. My father." "The board. They threatened to cut me off. I did it to save us. I never wanted Minjai. It was always you." He reached out, his hand trembling, grasping for the hem of her obsidian dress. "Come back to me. I can fix this. He's a monster, Pearly. Look at him. You don't belong in his world." Pearly looked down at the hand that had once held hers. Then she looked up at Jaiho. The tattoos on his neck were stark against his white collar, a map of violence and exile. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't tried to explain or excuse himself. He simply stood there, a solid, unshakable wall between her and the world. She looked back at Hanul, the man in the white tuxedo who looked like a prince but tasted like ashes. "You're right," Pearly said, her voice clear, ringing like a bell through the silent room. "He is a monster." She stepped closer to her husband, leaning into his warmth, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her arm. "But I prefer a monster who honors his word to a prince who lies." Hanul recoiled as if slapped. Jaiho finally moved. He didn't draw a gun, that would be too merciful. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the nearest banquet table. It slid across the white linen, spilling photos, bank statements, and printed emails, proof of embezzlement, offshore accounts, and the desperate, illegal loans Hanul had taken to float the failed merger. "The board might have pressured you," Jaiho said, his voice bored. "But the embezzlement was all you, nephew." The crowd swarmed the table like piranhas. Hanul screamed, scrambling to cover the papers with his hands, but it was too late. The flashes of cameras erupted again, capturing his ruin in blinding white light. Jaiho didn't watch. He offered his arm to Pearly. "Shall we, wife?" Pearly took it, turning her back on the chaos. They walked out of the ballroom together, leaving the prince in the ruins of his castle, while the queen ascended to her throne. The penthouse was quiet, but it was no longer the silence of a fortress. It was the hush of a sanctuary. Pearly stood on the terrace, the wind whipping the hem of her obsidian dress around her legs. Below, the city of Seoul was a sea of glittering light, unaware that the hierarchy of its underworld had shifted in the span of a single evening. Jaiho joined her, shedding his suit jacket and tossing it onto a lounge chair. He didn't speak immediately. He simply poured 2 glasses of amber whiskey and placed one in her hand. "The news is already breaking," he said, his voice a low rumble against the wind. "Choi Industries' stock is free-falling. Hanul is currently being escorted to a holding cell for fraud. His lawyers are resigning." Pearly took a sip, the burn of the alcohol matching the fire that had finally settled in her blood. "I should feel sorry for him," she mused, looking out at the skyline. "I should feel guilty." "But you don't." "No," she admitted, turning to face him. "I don't." Jaiho stepped closer, the moonlight catching the hard angles of his face and the dark ink scaling his neck. He looked at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "The contract is fulfilled, Pearly," he said softly. "The revenge clause is complete. You have your dignity back, you have the world's attention. Technically, you have your freedom." It was a test, the final test. He was offering her an exit, just as he had offered her the door of the limousine in the rain. He was giving her the choice to take her diamonds and run back to the daylight. Pearly set the glass down on the railing. She reached up, her fingers tracing the dragon tattoo on his throat, feeling the steady, powerful pulse thrumming beneath the scars. She thought of the safe, sterile life she had planned with Hanul, a life of polite dinners and hidden resentments. Then she looked at the man who had burned down his own family just to see her stand tall. "I didn't sign for revenge, Jaiho," she whispered, stepping into his space until there was no air left between them. "I signed for life." A rare, genuine smile touched Jaiho's lips, wicked, possessive, and devastatingly handsome. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, claiming her once and for all. "Then let them stare," he murmured against her lips. "Let them fear. The dragon has his queen, and we have an empire to rule." Pearlie kissed him, tasting the darkness, the danger, and the promise of forever. The ballroom was a distant memory. This was her reality now, dangerous, beautiful, and utterly hers.